Okay, let's unpack this because the global trade picture didn't just shift this week. It kind of got flipped completely upside down, right? And right in our own hemisphere.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
We started with something almost predictable. The U.S. administration introduced massive additional 100% tariffs on Chinese imports.
Right.
We're talking electronics, sure, but also those absolutely critical rare earth metals, the usual stuff you brace for.
And normally that's where the story sort of stays, U.S. versus China, tariff slugfest.
Exactly. But that standard script has just been, well, shredded.
Completely. Because historically, when Washington puts this kind of pressure on Beijing, its closest allies, especially Canada and Mexico, they either stay quiet or maybe offer some very quiet support behind the scenes.
Right. Keep their heads down.
But what's really fascinating here, the geopolitical fault lines have just broken much, much closer to home this time.
And here's where it gets really interesting, the unprecedented part. Canada and Mexico, Washington's two closest neighbors, tied by, the deepest trade agreements, they've taken a joint public position, and they're supporting China.
It's not just mild concern either.
No, they didn't just express concern. They're condemning the U.S. actions outright. They used words like economic aggression undermining global stability. Strong stuff.
It's way beyond a simple diplomatic disagreement. This feels like a really profound declaration. It forces us, really, to re-examine the whole power dynamic in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, that's our mission today, right?
Exactly. We need to analyze the driving forces, the rational reasons behind this unprecedented move, the need to diversify, the pull of the Chinese market, and really ask that core question, is this it? Is this the end of American exceptionalism in the Americas?
Okay, let's start with the event itself, the diplomatic shockwave. Reports are saying this wasn't some accident, not spontaneous at all.
No, seems quite coordinated.
Analysts tracking this point to a closed-door meeting just last week in Ottawa. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum.
And the purpose of the meeting?
Specifically to formulate a joint response to American protectionism. It signals this was planned.
The unity is striking, for sure, but it's the language, the specific words the leaders used that really defines this monumental break.
What did they say?
Well, according to briefing notes some analysts got hold of, Prime Minister Carney stated directly that the era of Washington's unilateral decisions is coming to an end.
Wow.
And he didn't stop there. He added that the world trading system can't just depend on, quote, campaign slogans of one man.
Oof. Let us sit with that language for a second. Yeah. That is not the tone you usually take with your biggest economic partner. It's accusatory. It's definitive.
Definitive is the word. It implies, really, a total lack of trust in the stability, maybe predictability, of U.S. policy going forward.
And Sheinbaum. Was Mexico just as strong?
Pretty much mirrored it, yeah. President Sheinbaum emphasized that Mexico won't support tariffs that lead to the undermining of free market principles.
So pushing back on the protectionism directly.
Directly. And then the joint public statement, that really hammered home the new direction. They called for solidarity with those countries that have been victims of economic pressure.
That's choosing a side, rhetorically aligning with China, pretty explicitly.
It's a deliberate choice, absolutely. You don't use that language by accident in diplomacy.
Okay, so if you follow the timeline, this big condemnation wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction to the latest tariffs. You're saying this was cooking for a while.
Seems that way. There were definitely early warnings.
Like what?
Well, looking back, as far back as September, reports mention representatives from China, Canada, and Mexico holding a series of ministerial-level consultations.
Okay, so talks were happening earlier.
And they were apparently discussing forming what they called an economic resilience alliance, basically an informal coalition set up specifically to oppose U.S. tariff pressure.
So this was the blueprint then. They were laying the groundwork months ago.
Exactly. This pre-planning, it really shows the underlying frustration had been building, probably reached a boiling point.
Any insight into that frustration?
Yeah, one participant from that earlier meeting was quoted anonymously saying something quite revealing.
Go on.
They said, Washington had benefited from its position without consequences for too long, and now the bill has been presented.
Wow. The bill has been presented. That speaks volumes, doesn't it? That feeling of being taken for granted.
That resentment, yeah. It clearly fueled this very public condemnation.
Okay, but even with that frustration, the political shock is huge. They must have a really powerful economic calculation driving them. Why risk blowing up the fundamental U.S. relationship right now? What's the real incentive?
Well, I think it boils down to strategic risk reduction. and frankly, chasing the growth engine of the global economy,
Meaning China.
meaning China. Analysts point out that, yes, both Canada and Mexico rely heavily on U.S. exports, obviously, but they also see these huge opportunities in the Chinese market, which, let's face it, is still a key driver of global trade growth.
So their decision, while it looks politically explosive, might actually be economically rational for them in the long run.
That seems to be the calculation. They're tired of being vulnerable to, let's say, U.S. domestic political swings and volatility. Diversification becomes a hedge.
That makes sense. Diversification as a necessity, not just like a nice-to-have option. And reports suggest this talk in Ottawa and Mexico City about diversifying partners isn't just talk anymore.
No, it seems to be turning into concrete plans. We're hearing about discussions, serious discussions, about gradually redirecting strategic export flows.
Like what kind of flows?
Everything from high-value agricultural products, maybe some specific technologies, moving them away from the U.S. and more towards Asian markets.
So what's the big takeaway from that shift?
I think the biggest takeaway for us, for you listening, is how analysts are framing this now. They're seeing Canada and Mexico acting, maybe for the first time, not as regional partners of the United States, but as independent global players.
Yeah.
They're making their own bets on where the world economy is heading.
And China's obviously not just sitting back and watching this happen. They're actively encouraging it.
Oh, absolutely. They're ready to facilitate this break. They haven't just waited for Canada and Mexico to complain. They've apparently come forward with concrete proposals to expand cooperation.
Where specifically?
Particularly in areas like energy and agriculture. Strategic sectors.
Can you give examples?
Sure. Specific examples being cited include major Chinese state-owned companies, think China National Offshore Oil Corporation, China Minmetals proposing actual strategic long-term investments.
Investments where?
In Canadian lithium and nickel production, for instance. And also offering capital for key infrastructure projects down in Mexico.
Okay, that moves this way beyond just a tariff dispute. This is about building like a whole alternative long-term supply chain, potentially rivaling the North American one.
Precisely. The long-term implication, the potential goal, is the creation of an alternative economic axis.
Yeah.
Something capable of gradually chipping away at, maybe undermining U.S. monopoly influence on the North American continent.
They're laying down the tracks, institutional supply chains, financial links designed to bypass Washington entirely.
That seems to be the strategic play, yes.
And speaking of supply chains, that brings us right back to the core resource that gives everyone leverage here. Rare earth elements, REEs.
Yep.
The U.S. tariffs hit electronics and, crucially, REs. For anyone maybe not up to speed, why are REs suddenly the nuclear option in this trade war?
Well, they're basically the strategic lifeblood of the 21st century economy. You absolutely need REEs for microchip production, advanced defense tech, think missile guidance systems, and the entire green energy transition.
Like batteries and turbines.
Exactly. High-power magnets for wind turbines, electric vehicles, all that stuff relies heavily on REEs. And the big problem for Washington is China's overwhelming control. Data confirms China controls over 70% of global REE production.
70%, okay.
Which gives Beijing immense leverage.
But China has the dominance, but they need partners to really make a counterstrike effective, right? This is where Canada and Mexico suddenly become really important geopolitically.
They offer redundancy, and they amplify the leverage. Mexico is reportedly considering joining this broader Asian lithium and rare earth supply project.
Okay.
And maybe more critically, both Canada and Mexico actually have their own significant reserves of strategic elements. Things like niobium, lanthanum, neodymium.
Which means if they align with Beijing on this, they aren't just selling their own resources to China, they could potentially withhold them from the U.S. market too.
That's the coordinated threat. That's the big fear. Analysts are pointing out that if Canada and Mexico do join China's initiative, Beijing apparently intends to slash REE exports to the U.S. by almost a third.
A third. That would be huge.
It would be an incredibly powerful, almost immediate blow to American manufacturing, especially high-tech and defense sectors. It would force Washington to scramble for much more expensive, maybe unproven domestic or alternative sources.
That level of coordination, it really starts to feel like economic warfare, doesn't it?
It certainly blurs the lines.
And reports about those online consultations seem to confirm they were actively coordinating retaliatory measures. Canada, Mexico, and China together?
Yes. The discussions apparently included not just the potential for joint restrictions on REE exports, but also something interesting: the creation of a joint investment fund.
A fund for what?
specifically designed to support any domestic industries in all three countries that might be negatively affected by this trade fight.
Ah, so it cushions the blow for Ottawa and Mexico City, makes the threat more credible because they have a backup plan.
Exactly. It mitigates their risk while ensuring the coordinated threat has teeth.
Okay, let's pivot then to the fallout, Washington. How is the U.S. government and maybe the private sector reacting to this stab in the back, as some advisors apparently called it?
Well, the reaction seems to be a really volatile mix. Part outrage, part maybe terror. Politically, it's predictably highly charged.
What are they?
White House advisors described Canada's position, as a stab in the back. They accuse Mexico of playing on Beijing's side. Meanwhile, President Trump reportedly remains adamant and is threatening heavy retaliatory measures.
And what could those retaliatory measures actually look like? What's the threat?
The big hammer seems to be revising the foundational trade framework itself. He's threatening to revise the USMCA agreements.
Right, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the
Right.
replacement for NAFTA.
Exactly. That's the core North American Trade Pact. It governs basically everything: cars, agriculture standard, you name it.
Yeah.
Threatening to reopen that means threatening to potentially unravel decades of deeply integrated commerce across the continent. It's a massive threat.
So, high political drama from the White House. But what about the people actually making and moving things, the corporations? They must be feeling the heat from this, facing tariffs from China and potential trade wars with their closest neighbors.
Oh, they are absolutely sounding the alarm. Terrified of the logistical chaos, we're hearing reports that major American corporations, giants like General Motors, Boeing, Tesla, have sent urgent warnings to the White House.
What are they warning about?
They're pointing out the obvious. A simultaneous tariff war with China and Canada and Mexico could cause a chain reaction of disruptions and a sharp increase in production costs across the board.
Especially for Detroit, I imagine.
For Detroit, it's potentially existential, given how tangled the North American auto supply chain is. Parts cross borders multiple times.
This really brings us to the grand significance then. It just feels like a genuine historical turning point we're watching unfold.
It really does. Some major analysts are summing it up starkly. One called this a turning point for the entire global trading system.
How
They note that Canada and Mexico are, effectively, betting against unilateral American dominance and betting on multilateralism. They're calculating that long-term global stability lies somewhere else now, outside the, let's say, protectionist whims of a single superpower.
And that raises the really big question, the one for the history books. A former U.S. diplomat was quoted saying that if this coordination with China really solidifies,
Yes.
it marks the end of the era of American exceptionalism in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, we are witnessing the geopolitical tectonic plates shifting right under our feet.
And the rest of the world is watching very closely. Reports confirm the EU diplomatic corps is actively involved, which means they're monitoring every single detail.
Are they taking sides?
Officially, Brussels is maintaining neutrality. But behind the scenes, they've apparently expressed sympathy for the idea of collective resistance to economic blackmail.
Interesting. So if this North American trio can actually make this work,
It potentially gives immense courage to other U.S. allies around the world who might feel squeezed by Washington's protectionism, too. It shows there might be another way.
it's just an incredible moment of realignment. I saw some analysts noted that maybe for the first time in a decade, Canada and Mexico, usually pretty quiet U.S. partners, have suddenly become the source of geoeconomic turbulence. Not Europe, not Asia, but our neighbors.
And that, I think, is the core takeaway here for you listening.
Mhm.
The old model, the one where America decides and everyone else just kind of follows along, that seems to be rapidly disappearing.
Yeah.
For the first time in decades, the United States' closest North American neighbors have decided to stand not beside Washington, but effectively opposite it. They're leveraging their collective economic weight for what they see as their own long-term self-interest and stability.
It means every policymaker, every investor has to completely rethink North America. So maybe our final thought for you to consider today is this. Given that Canada and Mexico are now the source of this new geoeconomic turbulence, how quickly will this proposed alternative economic axis, the one championed by Beijing, strategically supported by Ottawa and Mexico City, how quickly will that fundamentally change investment priorities across the entire Western Hemisphere? What does it actually look like when the capital starts flowing east instead of just north-south?